"No one's coming to help you," she whispered to herself, trembling behind the frozen windshield. But just as her body began to shut down, a stranger kicked open the door, changing both their lives forever. When a black mechanic finds an unconscious woman in a snowstorm, he doesn't know she's a billionaire CEO. He doesn't ask. He just saves her. But what starts as a rescue becomes something far more powerful, a life-changing bond between two strangers, a little girl's blanket of stars, and a legacy of kindness that echoes across generations. You won't believe what she does after she finds out who he is. Now, before we dive deeper, please subscribe to our channel. We share powerful, meaningful stories like this every day. And drop a comment below to let us know where you're watching from. Thank you so much. And now, let's get back to the story. "You better stay awake, baby," Tobias Hayes muttered under his breath, gripping the steering wheel with both hands as the truck shuddered against the shrieking wind. "Don't you dare fall asleep on me now." He wasn't talking to his daughter. The old Chevy wheezed like it was coughing up its last breath, its heater fighting a losing battle against the blizzard outside. Snow slammed into the windshield with furious force, thickening every second, the wipers barely making a dent. Tobias leaned forward, squinting into the blur of white that had swallowed Route 17 whole. In the back seat, 6-year-old Lena slept soundly under a faded fleece blanket patterned with cartoon stars. Her chest rose and fell in a slow rhythm, her small face peaceful, despite the war zone of ice howling just outside. Tobias shot a quick glance into the rearview mirror, then back to the road. What little was left of it. "Just get us home," he murmured like a prayer. Everything about the drive screamed danger. The snow had come fast, faster than even a Wyoming winter usually dared. One minute, it was a cold but manageable evening. The next, total whiteout. He'd seen these storms before, the kind that made men vanish from roads they'd driven their whole lives, the kind that swallowed entire trucks like shadows, but they'd waited too long. Lena had begged to stay late at the shop that day, wanting to help her dad organize his tools. And Tobias, as tired as he was, had said yes. He always said yes to her. She was all he had left. The heater groaned, barely pushing lukewarm air through the rusted vents. His fingers, knuckles pale and stiff, gripped the wheel tighter. The radio crackled again. Whiteout conditions expected to worsen. All travel on Route 17 strongly discouraged. Shelter in place advised. Too late for that. There were no shelters on this stretch of highway, just pine trees clawing the sky, a cracked 2-lane road, and silence thick as snowfall. He focused on what mattered. Keep the truck moving. Keep Lena warm. He imagined the house waiting for them. The creaky little place tucked behind a curtain of bare trees. The weak porch light flickering like it was powered by hope instead of electricity. Maybe if the power hadn't gone out, he could heat up some soup. Maybe cornbread if he hadn't forgotten to buy milk again. Maybe he could. A flicker. He saw it out of the corner of his eye, barely there, like the last glow of a dying star. Hazard lights, blinking orange through the snowfall, off to the right side of the road. Tobias's instincts kicked in like muscle memory. He eased off the gas, carefully bringing the truck to a crunching stop, tires skidding slightly as they bit into the icy road. "Come on now," he whispered. "Don't do this to me." He shifted into park, took a deep breath, and turned to check on Lena. She was still asleep, lips parted, a thin fog of breath curling against the frosted glass beside her. He hesitated. It was too cold to leave her for long. But someone might be in that car. Someone might already be dead. Tobias stepped out. The wind punched him in the face the moment he opened the door, cold slicing through his clothes like glass. He hunched against it, pulling his collar up and trudging forward, eyes squinting against the sting. The world had vanished around him, reduced to ghostly outlines of trees and the skeletal shell of a car. An Escalade, big and black and angled weird into the snowbank. The engine was off. The exhaust pipe was buried. One of the back tires spun helplessly in place every few seconds, ticking like a metronome out of rhythm. He approached cautiously, cupping his hands against the driver's side window and peering inside. "Hello?" he shouted, his voice swallowed by the wind. No response. Inside, a figure slumped over the wheel. A woman. Blonde hair spilling like frost over the steering column, her shoulders still. Tobias knocked hard. "Ma'am, you all right?" Nothing. His gut twisted. He jogged back to the truck, nearly slipping on the icy pavement, and yanked open the door. Reaching under the seat, he pulled out the crowbar he never went anywhere without. The storm wailed behind him like it wanted him to stop. He didn't. He sprinted back, heart hammering now, not from the cold but urgency. He circled to the passenger side. The window was cracked slightly, maybe just enough. He shoved the crowbar through the gap and worked the lock. One wrong move and the glass would shatter. But this wasn't his first time popping a jammed door. With a soft click, it gave way. The door swung open, nearly yanked from his hand by the wind. She slumped toward him immediately, her body limp, dead weight. "Jesus," Tobias breathed. He caught her before she hit the ground, his arms wrapping around a frame far too cold. Her lips were blue, her skin icy. Breath, if it was there, was barely perceptible. No, come on now," he whispered urgently. He didn't ask who she was, didn't check her wallet or her ID, didn't care that she looked like someone who hadn't had a bad day in a long time. All he saw was a life slipping away. And he wasn't going to let that happen. With her cradled tightly in his arms, he half walked, half slid back to his truck. He opened the passenger door with his elbow, gently laid her down, and turned the heater up as far as it would go. Then he took off his coat and wrapped it around her. The smell of oil and snow filled the cab. Her lashes were rimmed with frost. Her breathing was shallow, but there. "Daddy?" Lena's small voice broke through the tension. She was awake now, blinking slowly as she sat up behind him. "Who's that?" Tobias reached forward and brushed a strand of frozen hair from the woman's face. "Someone who needs help," he said softly. The heater rattled and wheezed. The storm roared louder now, as if angry they were still moving forward. But Tobias clicked his seatbelt and pulled back onto the road, one hand on the wheel, one eye on the pale stranger, breathing faintly beside him, and the other hand briefly reaching back to tuck Lena's blanket tighter around her shoulders. They were heading into the storm, but something had changed. And deep in his chest, Tobias Hayes knew this wasn't just a detour. It was the beginning of everything. The road disappeared beneath them, not in the metaphorical sense. It quite literally vanished, swallowed by waves of white that curled like smoke over the cracked asphalt, hiding every line, every sign, every clue that this was once a path people trusted. Now it felt more like a dare. A thin, treacherous thread through a world stripped of color, shape, and mercy. Tobias kept both hands on the wheel, arms taut, jaw locked. The snow came in hard gusts now, shifting sideways, like it had changed its mind about simply falling, and instead wanted to fight. Every turn of the tires felt like a gamble. Every flicker of the headlights revealed more of nothing. But in the passenger seat beside him, she stirred. Not much, just a faint twitch of her fingers under his coat. A ripple of breath stronger than the one before. Still colorless, still motionless, but alive. That was something. From the back seat, Lena had gone quiet. She was still sitting up, still wrapped in her blanket, her wide eyes glued to the pale woman resting only a few feet away. She wasn't scared, at least not outwardly, but Tobias could tell. She'd grown up fast in the silence that followed grief. She knew how to read a room, and right now the weight in the truck cab wasn't just cold air, it was something deeper. "Daddy," she said softly, "is she gonna be okay?" Tobias didn't answer right away. He wanted to say yes. He wanted to reach back and promise everything would be fine. That they'd get home and warm up and maybe watch cartoons on the couch like it was a normal night. But he knew better than to lie to her. Not when the truth was already cracking through the windshield like a hairline fracture in glass. "She just needs to get warm," he said, choosing each word carefully. "She's gonna be okay." Lena nodded once and curled back under her blanket. That was her way of trusting him. The truck groaned as it began the uphill climb to their house. The road was gravel in good weather. Now it was a skating rink. Tobias felt the wheels slide more than once, but he didn't slow down. He just leaned into the turn, coaxed the steering like it was alive, and muttered a prayer under his breath. When the porch light came into view, weak, flickering, but real, it was like spotting a lighthouse in a storm. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. They were almost there. He pulled as close to the front door as he could, the tires crunching through a foot of powder. The old house sat like a weary sentinel beneath a blanket of snow, its rusted roof catching drifts like a net. Smoke no longer curled from the chimney. The fire inside must have died while they were out. But it didn't matter. He had a plan. He turned off the engine, reached into the back, and looked at his daughter. "Stay in the truck, sweetheart. Keep the blanket over your head. I'll be right back." Lena nodded again, small and serious. She clutched her stuffed rabbit tight. Tobias stepped out into the cold, flinching as the wind bit instantly through his clothes. He opened the passenger door and leaned down to lift the woman into his arms. Her weight was light but lifeless, like holding a sack of melting ice. Inside, the house greeted them with a stale breath of air, cold, dry, tinged with old wood smoke and motor oil. Tobias kicked the door shut behind him and moved straight to the living room, lowering her onto the couch near the dormant wood stove. Then he went to work, boots off, socks on. Thick wool ones, pulled from a basket his grandmother had knit into existence a decade ago. Her own boots were damp and stiff, her jeans wet through. He didn't look away from her body. He just moved with the respect you give someone when time is running short. He pulled the patched quilt from the chair and wrapped it tightly around her legs. Then he headed to the small kitchenette, where a dented thermos of tea sat waiting from that morning. It was chamomile with honey, what Lena called magic tea. Still warm. He poured it into a chipped mug, crossed the floor, and gently tilted the woman's head. Her lips were cracked. He pressed the mug to them, let the liquid touch her tongue, a breath, a twitch, and then her throat moved. He held still, waiting. Her eyelids fluttered, heavy and disoriented. She blinked against the dim light, her eyes a sharp, glassy blue that tried to focus and failed. "You're okay," Tobias said, voice low. "You're safe now." She looked at him for a long moment. There was no fear in her expression, just confusion, as if the storm was still behind her eyes and she was waiting for it to pass. "Where?" she whispered. "Clearview," he replied. "You were in your car, passed out in the snow. I couldn't just leave you." She opened her mouth to speak again, but her voice gave out. She nodded instead and let her head fall back against the cushion. From the hallway, Lena peeked out from behind the curtain. She dragged her blanket behind her like a cape, stopping just short of the couch. "She's gonna be okay now, right?" she asked. Tobias looked at his daughter, then back to the woman. Her breathing was steadier. The color in her face, less ghostly. "She just needs to get warm." Lena took a step closer, held out her own blanket. "This one's mine," she said proudly. "It's got stars. It's really warm." The woman opened her eyes again, just enough to see the little girl. A soft smile tugged at her lips, more real than the storm had allowed. She accepted the blanket, her fingers brushing Lena's. "Thank you, sweetheart," she whispered. It was a moment that didn't ask to be remembered, but it would be. It hung there in the room like the first light of dawn, quiet and holy. Tobias stepped back and watched. Two strangers now shared his couch, one born of him, the other brought by fate. He didn't know who this woman was, didn't know her name or her story, or what she was doing out there alone in a blizzard in a car that cost more than everything he owned put together. But he'd found her, and that made her his responsibility, if only for the night. The wind outside eased, just slightly. The stove began to crackle again, and in that tiny house patched with effort and love, something began to shift. Not the temperature. Not yet, but something deeper, something like trust. "Daddy, do you think she dreams when she sleeps like that?" Lena's voice drifted through the hallway like a candle flicker, soft, flickering, curious. Tobias was kneeling beside the wood stove, coaxing flame from ash and memory. He paused, the match burning low between his fingers before he struck it again. "I don't know, baby," he answered, voice steady but thoughtful. "I hope she dreams of something warm." The flame caught. It licked up the side of the paper, hissed at the dry kindling, and in a moment, a new fire began to live. He fed it slow, layer by layer, watching it grow until heat began to radiate from the iron belly of the stove. The cabin sighed, as though exhaling a breath it had been holding since before he walked through the door. The woman, still nameless, lay beneath his star blanket and his grandmother's quilt propped up slightly with a pillow. Her cheeks were no longer chalk white, her breath no longer invisible. She wasn't well. But she was better. Tobias sat cross-legged on the creaky floor, watching her chest rise and fall. Her body was still, but not limp. Her shoulders curled inward now, what's like someone slowly waking from the kind of sleep that forgets time. His own shoulders, broad and worn from years under car hoods and single-father stress, began to unclench. Across the room, Lena was curled in her blanket like a burrito, hugging her stuffed rabbit. She didn't fidget or complain. She didn't ask why this woman was here. She just watched. Tobias had always said she was old-souled, born with questions most kids didn't even think to ask. The walls around them groaned. The wind still howled outside, but it was quieter now, less like a warning, more like a distant memory. And in that silence, he finally allowed himself to feel the weight of what had just happened. He'd pulled a stranger, frozen and breathless, from a car in a storm. He had no idea who she was, and it hadn't mattered. He'd carried her inside, covered her with his coat, warmed her with his fire, and it still didn't matter. He would have done it again, and again. She stirred. A sound, not a word, not yet, tugged Tobias's attention back to her face. Her lips moved. Her head turned slowly on the cushion. Tobias leaned forward. "Can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open, a little clearer this time. The blue in them still glazed, but not vacant. Where am I?" Her voice cracked like ice beneath a boot. "You're safe," he said gently. "My house. You were stuck out in the snow. I found you, brought you here." She blinked. "Snow, Escalade. You passed out," he nodded. "If I'd gotten there 10 minutes later," he didn't finish. She didn't ask him to. Instead, she tried to sit up, a soft groan escaping her lips as her body remembered it had limits. Tobias reached out instinctively and helped steady her with one hand at her back. She let him. Her voice was quieter now, but clearer. "My name's Diana." "Tobias," he replied. "Tobias Hayes." "That's my daughter, Lena." Diana turned her head slightly and saw the small girl peeking around the armrest. "Hi, Lena," she whispered. Lena didn't say anything at first. Then, after a moment, she nodded solemnly. "I gave you my best blanket," she said, almost shy. Diana smiled. "Thank you. It's the warmest thing I've ever felt." Lena beamed. Tobias leaned back against the wall and rubbed his tired eyes. It was surreal, this woman, this storm, this night that had gone from routine to remarkable in the span of a heartbeat. His mind kept circling the same quiet question. Why her? What was she doing out there, in the middle of nowhere? No phone, no help, no sense. But the question wasn't an accusation, it was a wondering. A wondering laced with something he couldn't name yet. Maybe fate, maybe luck, maybe something bigger. Diana coughed softly. Tobias reached for the thermos again and poured more tea. This time she held the cup herself, hands trembling slightly but steady enough to bring it to her lips. "You didn't ask who I was," she said suddenly. Tobias shrugged. Didn't seem important. Her eyes lingered on him. She was still assessing, not with suspicion, but with a curiosity that felt deeper than facts. She took another sip, then leaned her head back against the couch. "I was trying to get to Pine Hollow Lodge. GPS sent me on some back route. Car stalled, battery died, phone died with it. I thought I could walk to the highway, but my legs just stopped. You're lucky they didn't stop for good." She nodded slowly, eyes glassing over for just a second. "I thought they had." A silence settled between them again, not awkward, not forced, just quiet, a kind of shared exhale. Lena broke it first. "Do you live in a castle?" she asked, voice small but direct. Diana blinked. "What? You drive a castle car? Like on TV? Princesses drive those." Tobias chuckled from the corner. "She means your Escalade." "Oh," Diana laughed softly. No castle, just work." "What do you do?" Lena asked, sitting up now, blanket draped like a cape around her shoulders. Diana looked at her for a long beat, then smiled gently. "I fix cars." "You do?" Lena's face lit up. "Kind of," Diana said. "Not like your daddy, but I help people who do." Tobias looked over, eyebrows raised. There was something there, something unsaid. But he didn't push. Not yet. Later, when the fire was roaring, and Lena was asleep on the rug in front of it with her rabbit tucked under her chin, Tobias brought out a bowl of stew from the back burner. It was thick with potatoes and onions, a few strips of chicken floating like treasure in a sea of salt and heat. He handed it to Diana. She accepted it like it was gold. "This smells amazing," she murmured. "It's not much," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's more than enough." She tasted it, closed her eyes, and for a moment Tobias saw something unravel in her. Something guarded, something carefully held. "I forgot food could taste like this," she whispered. He didn't ask what that meant. He just watched her eat, And for the first time that night, he allowed the storm to become background noise. Because here in this modest home patched with memories and soot, something else had arrived. Not just warmth, not just survival, but something quieter, deeper, like grace. The snow stopped sometime around midnight. Tobias hadn't noticed the exact moment it happened. There was no grand signal, no dramatic hush, just a slow unwinding of tension in the air, like the storm had grown tired of screaming and finally gave in to silence. Outside, the trees stood still again, coated in thick blankets of white, like sentinels who had watched the worst and were now settling into sleep. Inside, the warmth was winning. The fire crackled steadily, sending flickers of orange across the faded wallpaper, dancing in the reflection of a chipped picture frame above the mantel. Lena snored softly near the stove, curled in a tangled nest of quilts, her rabbit tucked under one arm, her thumb just barely resting at the edge of her mouth. Tobias sat in the armchair across from the couch, elbows on knees, hands laced in front of him. His work boots, now dry and dusty from stove heat, sat nearby. The creases in his coveralls had softened, so had the tightness in his chest. Diana was awake, still pale, still recovering, but no longer fragile in the way that scared him. She'd finished her bowl of stew down to the last broth-soaked potato. Now she sat upright with the quilt pulled around her shoulders, and Tobias's coat still draped over her legs like a silent thank you. In her hands, she cradled the empty mug of tea like it had weight beyond ceramic. The stars on Lena's blanket peeked out beneath the quilt, glowing softly under the firelight. She hadn't said much in the past hour. Neither had he. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was a shared stillness, the kind that didn't need to be filled with noise. It simply existed, like trust or grief or snowfall. It just was. Diana shifted, the mug making a soft clink as she set it on the crate-turned coffee table between them. "You didn't even ask who I was," she said. Her voice was clearer now. Not strong yet, but grounded, like the cold had finally released its grip from her lungs. Tobias looked up. "Didn't need to." Diana's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion but curiosity. "You saw me, passed out, freezing, in a car that probably costs more than your house, and you didn't hesitate. You broke the window, pulled me out, drove me here, fed me." She trailed off, her voice thinning. "People don't do that." Tobias leaned back in the chair, running a calloused thumb along the curve of his palm. "They should." There was no self-righteousness in his tone, no pride, just plain truth. Diana studied him, his broad shoulders, the way he sat with his body still but alert, the years written in the lines around his eyes, the slight stoop in his back, the way his hands rested, scarred, rough, dependable. There was nothing polished about him, and yet everything was solid. "I've spent a lot of time around people who calculate every decision," she murmured. "Before they give anything, they ask what they'll get." "I've spent a lot of time fixing things people throw away," Tobias replied, "so I guess we've both seen what people do when something loses its value." Their eyes met across the firelight. No titles, no status, just two people. She glanced around the room. It wasn't fancy. There were coffee rings on the end tables, a curtain missing from one window, a stack of auto magazines on the floor, some yellowed with age, but everything in the house felt lived in, cared for. Nothing showy, just honest. On the far wall, above a sideboard lined with mismatched mugs, hung a small photograph. She hadn't noticed it before. It showed Tobias, younger but unmistakable, standing next to a smiling woman with skin like honey and eyes shaped just like Lena's. He had his arm around her shoulders. She was holding a baby swaddled in pink. Diana looked back at Tobias. "Your wife?" He nodded. "Julia, been gone 3 years." Her mouth opened, then closed again. There was nothing she could say that didn't sound small. "I'm sorry," she said anyway. "She gave me everything," he replied. "Still does. Even gone." Diana looked down at the stars on the blanket again, her fingers tracing the outline of one stitched in silver thread. "I don't think I've been given something this warm since I was a kid," she admitted. Tobias tilted his head. "Most people think comfort means money," she smirked faintly. "Most people I know think everything means money." "Then you know the wrong people." That caught her off guard. She laughed, quiet and honest. The sound filled the room like steam rising off hot soup. Across the floor, Lena stirred. Her eyes blinked open. She sat up halfway and rubbed her face, the rabbit falling to one side. "Is she still here?" she mumbled. Tobias smiled. Yep, she's still here. Lena crawled over to the couch, still wrapped in her blanket, and rested her chin on the cushion beside Diana's arm. Are you a princess? She asked, not quite awake, but serious. Diana smiled. No, sweetie, I'm just someone who got lost. Lena looked at her for a second. But you're better now? Getting there. Good. Lena nodded, satisfied. You can stay if you want. My dad makes good pancakes. Diana laughed again. This time her eyes shimmered, not from exhaustion, but something gentler. She reached out and tucked a curl behind Lena's ear. Thanks for the stars, she whispered. Lena gave a sleepy shrug, then curled back up on the rug and was asleep again before another minute passed. The fire crackled. Tobias stretched and stood, joints popping, and walked to the kitchen. He returned a moment later with another blanket, this one faded red, and handed it to Diana. It gets colder near morning, he said. She took it with both hands. You always take care of people like this? He sat back in the chair. Only the ones that fall out of the sky. That earned another smile. But behind her smile, she looked at him with something close to reverence. It was the kind of look people give you not when you've saved their life, but when you've reminded them of their own. I don't know how to thank you, she said quietly. Tobias waved her off. Sleep first, we'll figure the rest out later. She nodded, but something lingered in her eyes. She knew, somehow she knew, that this wasn't over, that this night wasn't just an interruption in her life. It was a pivot, a realignment, the kind that sneaks up on you in the middle of a snowstorm and sits down by your fire. And for the first time in a very long time, Diana Whitmore let herself feel it. She wasn't just grateful, she was humbled. The wind had quieted to a hush by the time the fire in the stove burned low, casting a soft, rhythmic glow across the wooden floor like the breath of something ancient. Shadows stretched across the walls, slow and quiet, while the world outside lay wrapped in the kind of cold that silences even the trees. Inside, time loosened its grip. Tobias had stoked the fire twice more, and then settled back into his chair, arms folded, legs stretched out, head leaned against the worn fabric. He wasn't asleep, but he wasn't entirely awake either. It was that space in between, where memories brush the edge of dreams and where grief no longer cuts like a knife, but hums like an old song. Diana hadn't spoken again. She sat on the couch, propped up with a throw pillow tucked behind her back. The red blanket Tobias had given her was pulled tight to her chin, and Lena's star blanket remained folded over her knees like a crown made of warmth. Her fingers, no longer trembling, curled around the mug Tobias had refilled for her, a second helping of the chamomile honey tea that she now sipped like it held the keys to her bones. She watched the fire. Not like someone watching flames, like someone watching time. Tobias finally broke the silence, his voice low but certain. Storms passed. Diana blinked, as though remembering she was still here. It doesn't feel like it yet. No, he agreed. It doesn't. There was a long pause before she added, I think something else is still settling. Tobias didn't respond right away. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, the glow from the stove reflecting in the deep brown of his eyes. He looked at her, not at the frostbitten woman he'd carried from a car, not at the face still pale from exposure, but at the weight behind her expression, at the way she held her shoulders like someone who used to carry power and forgot how it felt to let go. You've been driving with a full tank and no map, he said quietly. She didn't flinch, didn't deny it. Instead, she gave a soft, broken laugh. I've been running so long I forgot where I started, she whispered. And somewhere along the way, I convinced myself that running was the same thing as moving forward. Tobias nodded. It's not. She looked down into her mug. You said you fix things people throw away. Yeah. Ever fix people? He thought about that for a moment. I don't think people are things that need fixing. I think they need reminding. Of what? That they still matter, he said, simple as stone. Diana's breath caught in her throat, and she turned toward the fire to hide the tear that slid silently down her cheek. But Tobias saw it, and didn't comment. That was the thing about him. He never poked at wounds. He just sat near enough to keep you from bleeding alone. She composed herself slowly, sipping from her mug, watching the fire shrink and swell. Lena stirred near the hearth, her blanket sliding off one shoulder. Her little arms stretched wide, and she rolled onto her back, blinking groggily. Daddy? She mumbled. Tobias rose and walked to her side, kneeling to tuck the blanket back around her tiny form. "Right here, baby girl." She peeked up at him through sleep-heavy eyes. "Is it tomorrow yet?" "Almost." Lena reached up and tugged lightly at his sleeve. "Did the stars work?" Tobias glanced at Diana. The woman was watching now, eyes glistening. "Yeah," he said gently. "They worked just fine." Lena smiled, satisfied, and drifted back to sleep. When he returned to his chair, Diana met his gaze. "She trusts you completely." "I hope so," he said. "You don't talk to her like she's a kid." "She's not," he replied. "Not in the ways that count." A beat of silence passed between them, and then Diana spoke again, soft, vulnerable, unguarded. "I've built so many things in my life. Buildings, brands, systems, but I don't think I've ever built a moment like this." Tobias tilted his head. "Maybe you were never in the right place." "Maybe," she said. Then after a pause, "Or maybe I was always in the place people told me I belonged, not the one I needed to be." That struck something deeper in Tobias. He looked down at his hands, the grease under his fingernails, the calluses that never fully softened, the signs of a life that had never been glamorous but had always been real. "When Julia passed," he said slowly, "everyone told me to get help. Therapy, counseling, all good things, sure, but nobody told me the truth." "What truth?" "That sometimes grief isn't something you treat, it's something you carry, and some days it's heavier than others." Diana's throat tightened. "I think I've been grieving my whole life, just not for a person, for myself." That silence returned, thicker now, sacred. Outside, the frost still clung to the glass, but inside, something had thawed. They didn't know each other's full stories yet. They didn't need to. What mattered was what had passed between them in the quiet, the kind of knowing that doesn't come from names or resumes, but from recognizing a soul that's been weathered by the same storms. At some point, Diana leaned her head back against the pillow and closed her eyes. Not to sleep, but just to rest, without fear. Tobias let the fire burn a little longer, and when the flames dimmed to embers, he didn't light another match. He just sat there, in the warmth, in the stillness, beside a woman who had once been a stranger, but was now something else entirely. The world looked different by morning. Tobias stepped outside just after dawn, boots crunching through fresh snow, the kind that hadn't yet been touched by tire tracks or animal prints. The storm had left behind a landscape washed in silence, branches heavy with ice, rooftops sloped in white, the edges of the sky still tinged with lavender where the sun hadn't finished waking. He slung the battery charger over one shoulder and gripped a small toolbox in his other hand. His breath came in short white puffs, curling up around his face before disappearing into the cold. It wasn't snowing anymore, but the wind still bit sharp enough to remind him that the storm had only just ended and hadn't completely let go. The Escalade sat where he'd left it, half buried in the snowbank, windshield frosted, front grille dusted in ice. It looked out of place on the gravel road outside his modest home, like a cruise ship run aground in a lake. But Tobias didn't judge it. A machine was a machine. He'd fixed cars older than Lena, rustier than his roof, more neglected than anyone cared to admit. This one just needed to breathe again. He wiped off the hood with his sleeve and popped it open. The engine was clean, newer than most of what he worked on at the shop. No corrosion, no broken belts, just a victim of bitter cold and a dead battery. He smiled faintly. It could have been worse. With practiced hands, he connected the charger, tested the voltage, then moved to clean off the intake valves. He checked the alternator, swapped in a spare spark plug from the pouch in his coat. No fanfare. No shortcuts. Just work. He didn't mind. That was the thing about Tobias Hayes. He believed in leaving things better than he found them, whether it was a busted radiator or a broken heart. Inside the house, Diana had woken to the smell of pine wood and the soft buzz of cartoons on the old TV. Lena was sitting cross-legged in front of it, hair wild from sleep, a bowl of dry cereal in her lap, and her rabbit tucked under one arm. Diana sat up slowly. The red blanket slipped off her shoulders. Her fingers were still sore from the cold, but her mind was sharp now. She took in the room again, this time not through the haze of hypothermia, but with clarity. The wallpaper was peeling in one corner. The rug had been patched with denim. The chair she'd slept in creaked when she shifted. But it was all real, honest, and for reasons she couldn't yet explain, She felt safer here than she had in any penthouse she'd ever owned. She moved quietly to the kitchen, poured herself a mug of coffee from the pot still warming on the stove. It was strong and a little bitter, but it grounded her instantly. When she turned around, she found Lena watching her from the floor. "You sleep okay?" the little girl asked. Diana smiled. "I think that might have been the best sleep I've had in years." Lena nodded, then looked out the frosted window. "Daddy's fixing your car." Diana followed her gaze. She could just barely make out Tobias's figure, hunched over the hood of her Escalade, breath fogging the air, shoulders square against the cold. He hadn't waited for thanks, hadn't needed permission. He just did what needed doing. Diana walked slowly to the window, sipping her coffee, watching him work. She wrapped one arm around her middle, more for comfort than warmth. She found herself thinking about the men she usually met, ones with polished shoes and sharper tongues, men who measured success in shares and titles, men who could talk for hours and say nothing at all. And then there was Tobias, a man who had said almost nothing, and somehow told her everything. She wasn't used to this, to being helped without being assessed, to being seen without being appraised, and it made her wonder how much of her life had been spent mistaking wealth for value, mistaking control for strength. She finished her coffee, rinsed the mug, and walked back into the living room just as the front door opened. Tobias stepped inside, shaking off snow, toolbox in hand, battery charger slung over his shoulder. His cheeks were red, fingertips stiff, but his eyes met hers with the same calm as before. "Should be good now," he said. She blinked. "Just like that?" He shrugged. Battery was dead, swapped a plug, cleared the intake, engine should start. Diana stepped forward slowly. "You didn't have to fix it." Tobias tilted his head, setting the charger down beside the door. Didn't make sense to leave it broken. There it was again. That simplicity. That clarity. Like his life wasn't built around conditions or debts, but principles, and those principles didn't need explanation. He moved to the fire to warm his hands. Diana stood there watching him for a long moment, the words in her throat gathering like mist on glass. She wanted to say something big, something meaningful, but nothing she could think of sounded right. So she simply walked forward and extended the keys he'd left on the side table. Her fingers brushed his when he took them. "Tobias," she said, "I don't know how to thank you." He met her gaze. "You don't have to." "But I will," she said, voice quieter. "You may not think it matters, but I do." Lena appeared behind her, still clutching her rabbit. "Are you leaving now?" she asked. Diana crouched down to the little girl's level. "I should. I've got a long drive." Lena looked up at her, serious and wide-eyed. "Do you have stars where you live?" Diana hesitated, then smiled softly. "Not like yours." Lena reached up and gave her a quick hug, her tiny arms wrapped around Diana's neck for just a second longer than necessary. "Drive safe," she whispered. "I will." When Diana stepped out into the cold, it no longer felt cruel, just clean, crisp, quiet. She climbed into the Escalade, started the engine, which roared back to life on the first try, and paused with her hands on the wheel, eyes locked on the rearview mirror. Tobias stood in the doorway, arms crossed over his chest, not expectant, just present. Lena stood beside him, waving with one mittened hand, rabbit in the other. Diana rolled the window down halfway. "I mean it," she called. "I won't forget this." Tobias nodded. "Drive safe." She lingered one more second, then shifted into gear and eased onto the snow-covered road. As the house grew smaller in the mirror, a warmth bloomed in her chest. Not from the heater, but from something deeper. She didn't know it yet, not completely. But her life had already begun to change. The trees blurred past her windows like shadows of something she couldn't quite name, tall, frost-tipped, silent. The road beneath her tires was packed with snow, the sun catching glints of ice on the curves like a trail of quiet warnings. But Diana Whitmore didn't feel the cold anymore. Not the one outside. Not the one that had been living in her chest for years. Her fingers curled around the steering wheel, still faintly tingling from the ache of the storm, but steadier now. Her breathing was even. Her heart, no longer racing, beat with a soft, unfamiliar rhythm, one that had nothing to do with deadlines or boardrooms, and everything to do with the man who stood in his doorway without needing to be thanked. Tobias Hayes. She spoke his name aloud once, like a test, like a prayer. She hadn't asked what kind of man he was when he pulled her from that Escalade. She hadn't needed to. She had felt it. In the silence between his sentences, in the warmth of his coat around her shoulders, in the way his hands had known exactly how to move without ever making her feel small. He didn't ask who she was. He didn't care what she had or didn't have. He saw someone in need and made space. No performance, no calculation, just action. And Diana, who had built a life out of contracts, titles, and acquisition, realized as she rounded a bend that she had never known anyone quite like him. The lodge at Pine Hollow looked absurd when she finally arrived. Towering stonework, valet service despite the snow, a concierge who greeted her by name with faux concerned eyebrows and a glass of warmed brandy. Everything glittered. Everything was curated. Everything made her feel small in a way the tiny cabin never had. She checked in out of obligation, answered 3 missed calls from her assistant, responded to 1 email from the board. But her eyes kept drifting to the window, to the road leading back into the trees. Her thoughts kept drifting back to Lena's face, half buried in a star blanket, asking if she had dreams when she slept like that. That night, Diana didn't attend the welcome dinner. She sat alone in her suite, untouched plates delivered to her room, her phone lighting up with empty conversations. She sat wrapped in a lodge-branded robe with a roaring fire crackling in front of her. But none of it warmed her. Her body had survived the storm. Her soul was still walking back through Tobias's front door. 2 weeks passed. And the snow in Clearview began to loosen its grip. Icicles slid from rooftops in slow motion. The gravel road outside Tobias's home reappeared beneath melting slush. The shop called him back in early, a busted transmission waiting on his first morning back. Lena returned to school, her backpack bouncing against her spine, her curls wilder than ever. Life resumed, at least on the surface. But some things don't go back to how they were. Not after a night like that. Tobias found himself lingering longer on the porch in the mornings, sipping his coffee in silence as frost laced the railing. He caught himself watching the tree line, even though he knew she was long gone. And sometimes, in the quiet, he imagined her car again, blinking hazard lights slicing through the storm, the weight of her body in his arms. He didn't expect to hear from her. That wasn't why he'd helped. But when the envelope arrived in the mailbox, a thick, cream-colored one with no return address, his breath caught just the same. It was addressed to him in a clean, elegant script, not printed, handwritten. He turned it over once in his hand, then again, and then, slowly, he opened it. There were 3 pages inside. The first was a letter, penned in the same careful hand. Dear Tobias, I don't think I'll ever find the right words. But I'll try. That night changed me. You didn't know my name. You didn't ask what I did or what I could give. You opened your door, gave me your coat, your fire, your child's blanket, and not once did you expect anything in return. I didn't think people like you existed anymore. My name is Diana Whitmore. I run Whitmore Automotive Group. We have manufacturing facilities in 11 states. We build systems, we optimize performance, we sell results. But somewhere along the way, I stopped recognizing what integrity looked like. I stopped recognizing myself. You reminded me. You reminded me what quiet dignity is, what decency looks like when no one's watching. You didn't just fix a broken machine that night. You reminded me how to be a human being again. Thank you. Tobias stared at the paper for a long time. His fingers trembled slightly, not from cold, but from something closer to awe. He turned the page. The second document was official, a job offer. Lead technician and training supervisor, New Whitmore Regional Center, Helena, MT. Full salary, full benefits, flexible hours for single parents, relocation optional. He shook his head slowly, barely able to process the words. The third sheet was smaller, a payment confirmation. Mortgage, paid in full. Tobias sank down on the porch steps, the documents trembling in his hands, the world tilting around him in slow motion. The edges of his vision went blurry, not from fear, but from being seen. Not as a man holding it all together, but as a man who had held someone else up and changed her course. Behind him, the screen door creaked open. Daddy? Lena's voice was groggy. She stood barefoot on the threshold, her curls catching the wind, her rabbit tucked under one arm. You crying? She asked. He opened his arms without a word, and she climbed into his lap like she'd done 100 times before. Like nothing had changed, like everything had. He held her close, his voice thick with something beautiful. Yeah, baby girl, I am. Lena looked up at him. Why? He smiled, blinking through tears. Because sometimes, when you do the right thing, not for thanks, not for show, just because it's right, it finds its way back to you, bigger than you ever imagined. Lena blinked. Like magic? He laughed gently. No, like love. The first thing Tobias did after reading the letter was not call the number printed at the bottom. He didn't scan the offer. He didn't calculate the salary against his bills or weigh the health plan or imagine himself in a new garage with clean floors and state-of-the-art lifts. He just sat there, on the edge of the porch in the soft morning light, holding the letter like it might disappear if he moved too quickly. Lena rested against his chest, her tiny arms warm and sleepy around his ribs, her rabbit squished between them like an afterthought. She didn't ask more questions. Not yet. She just stayed, and that silence, that sacred, golden silence, felt like the answer to something Tobias hadn't known he'd been asking. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man pushing uphill. He felt like a man who'd been recognized. Not for the weight he carried, but for the way he carried it. That afternoon, he did what he always did. He went to work. He wiped down his tools, rolled under a '92 Silverado with a cracked oil pan, and fixed it without complaint. He refilled the soda machine in the break room. He handed out socket wrenches to a high school apprentice with shaky hands and too many questions. He didn't tell anyone about the letter. He didn't need to. It wasn't about boasting. It was about belonging. And that feeling, that deep, rare feeling of being truly seen, wasn't something he wanted to share too soon. It was still blooming inside him, delicate and private, like a seed finally given light. Later, when the sun dipped low and Lena returned home with crayon-streaked cheeks and a backpack full of glittered chaos, he made them soup again. The same kind he'd given Diana. Chunks of potato, broth seasoned with love, and a warm corner of cornbread baked in the toaster oven. They ate on the floor, watching a VHS copy of Homeward Bound, the rabbit propped between them like an honored guest. Lena talked about spelling tests and a classmate who insisted Pluto was a planet. Tobias laughed, nodded, and listened, but part of him, just a small part, kept looking out the window, toward the world that now felt open in a new way. 2 days later, another letter arrived. This one wasn't cream-colored, it was plain white. Standard envelope. Handwritten return address in the corner, D. Whitmore, Montana. He stood at the mailbox staring at it for a long moment before tearing it open, the envelope soft from travel, the ink inside as bold and careful as the last. Dear Tobias, I hope you're not overwhelmed or angry. I struggled with whether to send the offer right away. I wondered if it would feel like charity. I realized later it wasn't about giving you anything. It was about acknowledging what you'd already given me. I've been in boardrooms for decades, rooms where I was the only woman, the only person without a trust fund. I worked twice as hard for half the credit, and somewhere along the way, I hardened. I forgot what I wanted to build in the first place. But when I woke up on your couch, wrapped in your daughter's star blanket, something shifted. You didn't speak much, but everything you did told me exactly who you were. Not once did I feel judged or pitied. Not once did you ask for credentials or favors. You just saw me. And I think that might be the most powerful thing anyone's ever done for me. That's why I'm opening the Helena Center. Not to hand out opportunities like candy from a stage, but to create a space where people like you belong. People who show up, quietly, with their sleeves rolled up and their hearts wide open. I'd be honored if you'd join us. But whether you accept or not, know this, I carry that night with me. Every day. Tell Lena the stars worked. Always. Diana. Tobias folded the letter slowly, then sat down right there on the porch step. The same spot where he'd sat holding her frozen body in his arms, begging her not to die. The same spot where he'd told Lena that doing the right thing comes back around. And it had, in ways he never could have imagined. The next morning, he pulled Lena into his lap while she brushed her teeth, wild curls bouncing as she leaned into his shoulder. You remember the lady we helped? He asked softly. Lena nodded. The one who said I was brave? That's the one. She okay? She's more than okay. He kissed the top of her head, then pulled the star blanket down from her bed. She wanted me to tell you, he said, wrapping the blanket around her like a cape. The stars did work. Lena beamed like she already knew. Miles away, in a tower of glass and steel where the snow had long melted from the sidewalks, Diana Whitmore stood in her office, a mug of tea in her hands. On the desk beside her sat the thank you note Tobias had scribbled weeks after receiving her offer. It wasn't typed, it wasn't eloquent, it was just 5 words: "You didn't owe me anything. But you gave me everything." She hadn't framed it. She kept it tucked into the inside pocket of her coat, close to her heart. That morning, she canceled a meeting with investors and rescheduled a call with a European distributor. Instead, she boarded a plane to Helena. The regional training center was still under construction. The sign out front wasn't even mounted yet, but the floors were polished. The workbenches stood in rows. And in the back office, a window looked out toward the mountains. That's where she stood when her phone buzzed. New text from T. Hayes. "Appreciate the offer. Got a little girl who thinks stars are real magic. Wouldn't mind showing her what it looks like when one lands close to home. I'm in." Diana smiled, eyes brimming. She tucked the phone into her coat, turned toward the snow-tipped horizon, and whispered to no one, "Welcome home." The regional training facility in Helena wasn't flashy. There were no cutting ribbons with gold scissors, no reporters standing outside to broadcast corporate benevolence. But inside the glass-paneled building with steel bones and the smell of fresh sawdust, there was something better. It felt like a beginning. Not the grand trumpets blaring kind, the quiet kind, the honest kind. The kind that grows like sunrise, slow, steady, and inevitable. Tobias Hayes stood near the front of the workshop floor, a clipboard in one hand and a torque wrench in the other. His new uniform, dark navy with his name stitched above the pocket, felt strange at first. Too crisp, too new. But Lena had insisted he wear it on the first day. "You look like a superhero, Daddy," she'd said, tying his shoelaces even though he could have done it himself. That alone made him walk into the building with his head a little higher. He'd been there for 3 days, helping assemble the training curriculum, organizing tools, overseeing safety inspections. No media, no microphones, just real work, just real people. And every single one of them had been handpicked by Diana Whitmore herself. Veterans, single moms, people fresh out of prison looking for a second shot, people who'd built lives around survival, not privilege, people with hands like his. People who knew what it meant to be overlooked, and what it felt like to be seen. On the 4th morning, Diana arrived. She didn't enter through the executive office entrance. She didn't announce herself or come trailing assistants. She parked her SUV in the gravel lot and walked in through the side, wearing jeans, a windbreaker, and a travel mug of black coffee. Tobias spotted her the moment she stepped onto the floor. She looked the same, but lighter somehow. Like some invisible weight had been lifted from her chest. He didn't approach her right away. He was in the middle of walking a 19-year-old trainee through a cylinder head rebuild. So he kept talking, eyes on the work, voice steady. That was Tobias, present no matter who entered the room. When he finally stepped away, Diana was leaning against one of the steel beams, watching him with a faint, quiet smile. "Coffee any good?" he asked. "Better than I deserve," she said. They stood facing each other, hands in their pockets, the low hum of work surrounding them like a heartbeat. Neither of them rushed the moment. "I didn't expect you so soon," he added. "I didn't expect you to say yes," she said. He looked at her. "I didn't say yes because it was a gift. I said yes because it was right." Diana nodded, the smile in her eyes deepening. "Still driving the Chevy?" she asked. He chuckled. "She's holding together, like me." There was a pause, and then she added, "You know, when I was freezing in that car, I kept thinking, this is it. Not because I was afraid to die, but because I couldn't remember the last time I felt like I had lived." Tobias didn't say anything. He didn't need to. "You changed that," she said. "You changed me." "Funny," Tobias murmured. "I was about to say the same." They stood there a while longer, the kind of quiet between them that didn't need to be filled. It was already full, with understanding, with gratitude, with a memory that had become something much more. Later that afternoon, Tobias walked into the break room and found Lena perched on a stool, her feet swinging beneath her, coloring in a workbook. Diana sat across from her, sipping tea, nodding with solemn interest as Lena explained the rules of a drawing game she'd made up herself. Every color means something, Lena said. Purple is for brave, yellow is for happy, blue is for when someone's feeling shy. Diana raised an eyebrow. What's red? That's for when you love somebody but don't say it out loud. Tobias froze for just a beat in the doorway. Diana didn't look at him, but her hand, resting on the table, curled slightly over her mug. Lena didn't notice the silence. She held up a half-finished drawing. It showed a little girl, a tall man with a beard, and a woman wrapped in a blanket with stars, all standing in front of a small house with a glowing orange window. Diana reached for it gently. Can I keep this? Lena nodded. Only if you promise to hang it where you can see it. Diana smiled. I promise. That night, Tobias walked out of the facility after dark, the lot bathed in soft lamplight. Lena skipped beside him, her hand in his, her backpack swinging like a pendulum. They didn't rush. They never did. Not anymore. The air was crisp. The snow had melted enough that patches of earth peeked through the ice. The stars overhead blinked in rows, scattered like shy secrets across the sky. He looked up and whispered, They worked, huh? Lena followed his gaze. I told you, she said simply. Back in the city, Diana sat by her office window, the skyline stretching out beneath her in cold steel and light. She no longer loved this view the way she once did. It looked impressive, but it didn't feel like home. She turned away, walked to her coat hanging on the hook, and pulled from the pocket the folded note Tobias had written. She didn't unfold it. She didn't need to. She knew every word. You didn't owe me anything, but you gave me everything. She ran her finger along the crease, then stepped out of the office and didn't return for the rest of the night. Some things don't need a ceremony to matter. No headlines announced the beginning of Tobias Hayes' new chapter. But every bolt he tightened, every young trainee he mentored, every late-night story he shared with Lena while she rested her head on his chest, those were the milestones. And somewhere deep inside both of them, him and Diana, there was now a place reserved for that night in the snow. For the woman who had forgotten who she was. For the man who reminded her without ever needing to say a word. And for the child who gave away her stars without hesitation. The first spring rain came early that year. It fell softly on the tin roof of Tobias's house, drumming out a rhythm that didn't rush, didn't demand. The same roof that had once echoed with the thump of snowstorms and the moan of wind now sang a gentler song, a song of beginnings. Inside, Lena sat at the kitchen table coloring a new picture. This one had a building with a shiny sign that read Whitmore Training Center, and beside it, a man in a blue uniform holding a wrench like a sword. Above him floated a blanket of stars, and beside him, a woman with long hair and blue eyes, handing out mugs of tea to everyone who walked through the door. She looked up as Tobias walked in from the garage, wiping his hands with an old rag. Almost done, Daddy, she said. Take your time, he replied, hanging the rag by the door. It's a masterpiece. Lena grinned and turned back to her work. Tobias stepped to the window. The rain glistened on the gravel road, puddles forming in familiar dips. He sipped from a chipped mug, coffee that had gone lukewarm hours ago but still tasted like routine, like quiet, like home. Behind him, the TV played an old jazz record from the turntable. No news, no static, just music and the hum of something steady. He had never imagined his life changing like this. He hadn't planned for opportunity. He hadn't chased it. It had arrived on his doorstep with frostbitten fingers and a whisper of breath left in its lungs. And now he was part of something bigger than survival. At the training center, people had begun calling it the Bridge. Not officially. The building still had its shiny modern nameplate, but within those walls, between the workbenches and the break room, under the vents and along the halls, people started to refer to what had happened there as a bridge, because that's what it had become. A crossing between who they'd been and who they could become. A place where veterans rediscovered purpose, where former inmates found dignity, where single mothers learned skills with their children sitting 3 feet away building Lego cars. And it started with a storm, with a man who didn't hesitate, and a woman who remembered what it meant to feel small and to be held with grace anyway. Diana visited often, never unannounced, never as the boss. She didn't wear suits anymore when she came. She wore jeans, boots, and always brought a tray of muffins from the same bakery Lena liked. She knew the names of every apprentice. She listened to stories that had nothing to do with profit margins or production quotas. She brought her dog once, a rescued mutt named Ranger, who followed Lena around all day like a fuzzy shadow. And sometimes in the quiet moments, after the tools had been put away, after the laughter had softened, she and Tobias would sit together outside on the back steps of the facility and just watch the wind move through the grass. Not every moment needed words. They understood each other now in a way few people ever do. One afternoon, months after the storm, Diana stood at the edge of the workshop and watched Lena help organize socket sets on a low shelf built just for her. She wore a navy apron with her name stitched on the front, Lena H., and had her hair braided down the middle, messy and proud. "Stars still working?" Diana asked as she approached. Lena turned with a grin. "Always." Diana crouched beside her. "You know, I think that night, when I wore your star blanket, it gave me something more than warmth." "What?" Lena asked. "Direction." Lena tilted her head. "Like GPS?" "Better," Diana said, "like a compass." Lena considered that, then handed her a wrench. "You can help me organize." "I'd love to." That night, as the sun set over the Helena Hills painting the sky in shades of coral and violet, Tobias and Diana stood together outside the shop, watching Lena chase Ranger in wild, joyful circles. "She belongs here," Diana said softly. Tobias nodded. "So do you." She looked at him, something quiet blooming behind her eyes. "I think I do." There was a time when those words would have terrified her, when commitment felt like a cage and home like a concession. But here, on gravel roads and cracked floors and with the sound of a child's laughter chasing a dog, she felt none of that. Here, she felt free. "I used to think power meant being untouchable," she whispered. "Now I think it means being reachable, letting the right people in, even if it scares you." Tobias didn't say anything at first. Then he looked at her and said, "I don't think it's scary anymore." In time, others would learn the story. Not the one in press releases or glossy brochures, but the real one. Of a man who saved a stranger in the snow because it was the right thing to do. Of a woman who built an empire but almost froze inside her own loneliness. Of a child who believed her stars were magic and was absolutely right. And of how, on a forgotten road in the middle of nowhere, kindness became the bridge that carried them into the lives they never dared to dream. Years later, when Lena stood on stage at her high school graduation, valedictorian with grease under her fingernails and a welding scholarship in her pocket, she opened her speech not with a quote from a president or a poem from a book. She held up a picture, the same one she'd drawn as a child. And she said, "This is the night everything changed. A night when my dad taught me that kindness isn't something you give, it's something you live. A night when a stranger became our family. And a night when I learned stars don't just shine, they guide." There wasn't a dry eye in the room. Some stories don't end with credits, they ripple. And if you were to drive down a snowy road years later, headlights slicing through the frost, you might still see the faintest glow of hazard lights blinking in the distance. And if you follow them, you just might find a house with a porch light that always stays on. A girl who keeps a toolbox next to her coloring books, and a man who never stopped believing that the right thing done quietly will always echo louder than the wrong thing done loudly. Because the storm didn't bury them, it built them, together. To anyone watching this, sometimes the world tells us kindness is weakness, that helping a stranger won't change anything. But Tobias didn't believe that. He didn't ask what Diana had or who she was. He just saw someone freezing in the dark and opened his door. And because of that, a billionaire remembered her soul, a mechanic found his calling, and a little girl proved that stars can still guide us home. Never underestimate the impact of one quiet, decent act, because in a world frozen by silence, kindness is the fire that still burns. If this story moved you, leave a comment below. Tell us what kindness means to you, and remember to subscribe for more stories that restore your faith in humanity, because sometimes all it takes is one storm to build a bridge that lasts forever.